بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. نويت التعلم والتعليم والتذكر والتذكير والنفع والانتفاع والإفادة والاستفادة والحث على تمسك بكتاب الله وسنة رسوله سبحانه وتعالى. Alhamdulillah. So we see now after the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam that the Byzantine and the Eastern Roman Empire, that they had prepared an army to come and attack the Muslims, and it was an army of over 40,000 fighters that were going to come and attack the Muslims. So the Prophet ﷺ, rather than waiting for them, he decides that he will set out with an army to go and meet them. So in the month of Rajab, in the 9th year after Hijrah, the Prophet ﷺ, he sets out with an army, and this was in the peak of summer. Right in the middle of summer, the Prophet ﷺ sets out with his soldiers, and this time he tells the soldiers, the Muslims, where they will be going and who they will be fighting, because he knew that they would have to travel to a very distant place, and so there will be lots of walking and the soldiers will be tired, and two, that the weather being in the middle of summer, that it will be really hot, so it will be a difficult journey, and three, that they will be away from their families for a long time. So the Prophet ﷺ, he is already preparing his soldiers for the journey, so that they are aware of what lies before them. And so when the hypocrites heard of this, that this is what the Prophet ﷺ was planning, they didn't like going to any wars, and so this even more so, they didn't want to go out to this war, and so they started having doubts and trying to instill doubts into others. So they didn't want other people, because otherwise, if they only didn't go, then they would look bad. So they were trying to persuade others not to go on this expedition. So one of them, Al-Jad ibn Qais, he came to the Prophet ﷺ and he asked the Prophet ﷺ for permission to stay at home. And his excuse was that, so he didn't want to go on this expedition. His excuse was that he was too weak, and that he also had weakness for women, that if he saw a woman from the enemy's tribes, that he wouldn't be able to control himself. And so the Prophet ﷺ, and look at the shameful excuse that he was giving to the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ just turns away and grants him permission that you don't need to go, and he just turns away from him sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Some others, they set out from Medina to go on the expedition, but then turned back, and from those was Abdullah ibn Ubay, who set out with some of his soldiers, pretending to go out on this expedition with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But as soon as they reached their first camp, when they set out and they camped just outside Medina, when the Prophet ﷺ moved on with the soldiers, he returned with his soldiers back to Medina. And so in regards to these hypocrites, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala then revealed verses of the Quran where he says, أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم فرح المخلفون بمقعدهم خلف رسول الله وكرهوا أن يجاهدوا بأموالهم وأنفسهم في سبيل الله وقالوا لا تنفروا في الحر قل نار جهنم أشد حرا لو كانوا يفقهون. Those who remained behind rejoiced in their staying at home after the departure of the Messenger of Allah sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and disliked to strive with their wealth and their lives in the cause of Allah, and said, do not go forth in the heat. Say to them, the fire of hell is more intensive in heat, if they would but understand. So Allah revealed these verses to the Prophet ﷺ in regards to those hypocrites. But the real believers and followers of the Prophet ﷺ, they came running forward and put themselves forward, and not only giving themselves, but also giving up their possessions for the army, and giving their wealth, in donating their wealth towards the army. And so from amongst them, who led by example, Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan radiyallahu ta'ala anhu, that he gave 300 camels with their saddles, and also 1,000 dinar. And imagine 300 camels were donated by Sayyidina Uthman ibn Affan for this expedition, and then 1,000 dinar on top. And so the Prophet ﷺ, when Uthman brings this and he donates this, the Prophet ﷺ says Uthman can do no wrong, does no wrong after this day, and no and no one will cause him any harm. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And this was the Prophet ﷺ giving, testifying towards the uprightness of Uthman ibn Affan, and that nobody can accuse him of any wrong after this day. Radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And so Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab, he comes out and he says to himself, and he narrates that he said to himself, today I will outdo Abu Bakr. He's always outdone me, he's always one step ahead of me, but today I will outdo him. And so he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he says, Ya Rasulullah, I will donate half of my wealth, everything I own, I will give half of it in for this expedition and for the army. And so the Prophet ﷺ is pleased, and he accepts, makes dua for Umar. And then Abu Bakr as-Siddiq comes, radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and he says to the Prophet ﷺ, Ya Rasulullah, I give everything I own, all of my wealth, everything I own I give in the way of this, in the way of Islam, and in this expedition. And the Prophet ﷺ, he says, Ya Abu Bakr, what have you left for your family? And he says, Ya Rasulullah, I have left them Allah and His Messenger, and that's enough for them. And so Sayyidina Umar bin Khattab, he says, Wallahi, he says, I can never outdo him in anything. I can't outdo Abu Bakr as-Siddiq. And so like this we see that the great companions of the Prophet ﷺ came forward and donated as an example, and then the other companions came forward and began to give them, one, pledge their own allegiance, and two, that they would give from their own wealth and donate towards the cause. And from amongst some of the Muslims that came forward, they became known as the weepers, and that's because they came forward and they wanted to go on the battle, but they didn't own anything. They had no wealth, they had no ride to go on this journey. And so, being from those who had nothing and had no ride, which is more important, that the Prophet ﷺ turned them away, and when he turned them away, they began to weep, and they wept. And so they were known as the weepers. And the reason why the Prophet ﷺ turned them away was that this was an expedition that was going to be tiresome. They would have to go to a place that's very far, and so they would need a ride. And as they didn't have a ride, that they were not able to go on the expedition. So the Prophet ﷺ, he gathers, and we see here the Sahaba, and they're rallying around the Prophet ﷺ. So even this, knowing where they were going to go, and this to such a far place in the middle of the summer, and that in previous battles we were seeing, a few thousand come forward, a few hundred initially, and then a few thousand, and then it would grow. And now we see the Prophet ﷺ sets out with an army of 30,000 men, mashallah. So he sets out, and the Sahaba came forward, those who were firm in their belief came running forward. But there were still some Muslims who remained behind, and these were Muslims who were sincere, and their faith wasn't questionable. They weren't hypocrites, rather they were sincere Muslims and devoted to the way of Islam and to the Prophet ﷺ. But they stayed back for different reasons, and from them was Sayyidina Ka'b ibn Malik, and Murara ibn Rabi', and Hilal ibn Umayyah, and also Abu Khaythama, who initially he didn't set out with the Prophet ﷺ, but after several days that he stayed at home, and he came home and it was hot, and when he came home, his wives, he had 2 houses and each wife came out, and they came out prepared with hot food for him. And so when they saw the food that he saw prepared for him, and the cold drink and the food, he stopped and he didn't enter either's house. And so he said to himself, he says, the Messenger of Allah, Allah's Messenger is out in the hot sun and the wind, and whilst I'm sitting here in the shade with food prepared for me and with this water to drink. And he says, Wallahi, this is not fair. And he says, I swear by Allah that I will not come to either of you, I wouldn't come to either one of you, my wives, until I have caught up to the Messenger sallallahu alaihi wasallam. So he immediately leaves and catches up to the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so the journey was long and it was tiresome. It was hot. There wasn't much to eat other than the animals that they were riding, the camels that they took with them, and they began to slaughter the animals, the camels, just to drink the water that was inside their bellies. So not for the need of the meat, but they ate the meat, but more for the water that was inside these camels. And so we see that this was a tiresome journey which the Sahaba went on with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And when they went all this distance and they arrive at Tabuk, that they find when they arrive there that the enemy had set up camp and has already left. And so when they see this, you would think that they will become disheartened and the like, because they've set out on such a far journey and they will think it's a waste of time. But no, that's not the case, and rather it was still in benefit of the Muslims, because a number of local tribes, they came to the Prophet ﷺ and they either entered into and became allies of the Prophet ﷺ, or they became Muslim. So it was still in benefit of the Muslims to come out all this distance. So we then see the Prophet ﷺ, he tells the army that they will now return back to Medina. And so the Prophet ﷺ returns back to Medina in the month of Ramadan. He arrives in same year in the 9th year after Hijrah. So they were away for a period of 2 months. And so when he, on his way back, he mentions to the companions that there are some in Medina who were with us, and that they didn't come out on the expedition, but they were with us, but who were held back because of valid excuses. Because the Sahaba, some of them would have felt that why didn't so and so come, and why didn't so and so come. So the Prophet ﷺ tells his companions that there's some that were held back due to valid excuses. And so when he arrives back, the Prophet ﷺ, first, as he always would, he goes to the masjid and he prays 2 rak'ahs for arriving back. And then people begin to come and see him and visit him. And around 80 people who remained, who didn't go on the expedition, came to see him sallallahu alaihi wasallam and offer their excuses. And they tell the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam what was their excuse for not going. So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he accepted their excuses, but he postponed judgment on certain cases, and those were of 3. In the case of Ka'b ibn Malik, Murara ibn Rabi' and Hilal ibn Umayyah. He didn't pass judgment on these 3 until revelation came to him sallallahu alaihi wasallam in regards to them. And so Ka'b ibn Malik, he narrates himself, he says that in regards to him, he says, there wasn't a man in the world stronger or in easier circumstances than me, but I hesitated saddling my horse until everyone had left. And he goes, I wish I had. He said, whenever I went out, it grieved me to see the only other people who were out in Medina were hypocrites and the weak. So he wanted to go with the Prophet ﷺ, but he hesitating to the point where the Sahaba and the Prophet ﷺ had left. And so he says that when I went out in Medina, I would see only people that were hypocrites who didn't want to go on the expedition. And that wasn't in his case. He wasn't a hypocrite. And only those who were weak, who had nothing, they couldn't go. And so he says, when I heard the Prophet ﷺ was on his way back, he goes, I started to think to myself of what will I tell him. And I started to think of all these lies that I will tell him. I'll give him an excuse. So he's now thinking of all these things to tell him. But he says, but when he arrived sallallahu alaihi wasallam, he says, I wasn't able to tell him a lie, and I told him the truth. That what is my case? So the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, when he arrives back and he comes to see the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and he says that the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam smiled at him, but angrily. So he smiles at him, but with an angry look. And so he says to him, come here. And then he asks him what stopped him from coming out. He says, did you not have a right? Do you not have something to ride on? And he says that I answered the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam in truth, that I had a ride, my circumstances were easy, but he hesitated. And so the Prophet ﷺ says in regards to him, he says in regards to Ka'b, he said he's told the truth, and now he must wait Allah's judgment in regards to him. Murara ibn Rabi' and Hilal ibn Umayyah were also both righteous men. They weren't from hypocrites, and they both took part in Badr. And so the Prophet ﷺ, in regards to these three, Ka'b, Murara and Hilal, he said to the Muslims that nobody should speak to these three until Allah reveals their judgment to him ﷺ. And nobody knew at what point that Allah will send revelation to his Prophet ﷺ. And so this went on for 50 days where nobody would speak to these three. And so Murara ibn Rabi' and Hilal ibn Umayyah, they were older, and so they stayed in their homes and waited for that revelation to come, and they didn't go out much. Whereas Ka'b, he himself says that he says, I was young and I couldn't stay at home, and nor could I stay away from the Prophet ﷺ or the companions. He just wished to see them, so he would go to the masjid every day, he says. So he'd go and pray in the masjid, and he would just stare at the Prophet ﷺ, hoping to get a glance, a look from the Prophet ﷺ that would indicate that he's forgiven him or something. But the Prophet ﷺ was waiting for revelation. So it wasn't a matter of forgiveness, rather he was waiting for revelation from Allah, that Allah will give the hukm in regards to these three. And so he says that after the salah, after the prayer, I would go and I would give him salam after prayers, and then I would look at his lips, that was he replying to me or not. And he says that he would do this every day to see if the Prophet ﷺ turns away from him or not. And so one day, whilst in Medina, and he's now, all these days have passed and no one is talking to these three, news spreads outside of Medina that this is what's happened because of the hypocrites. So he says one day a man from outside Medina comes, and he comes looking for Ka'b in particular, and he gives him a letter from Banu Ghassan of the Levant. This was a tribe in the Levant, and they send a letter to Ka'b, and it says on it that he says that we see Muhammad treating you in this way, not being hospitable towards you, and that he's not treating you in a decent manner. And so he says, they say you will suffer ruin or humiliation, so it's better for you to come and join us. And so Ka'b, he says that when I read the letter I became angry and immediately burnt the letter. Who dares speak like this about the Prophet ﷺ? And rather Ka'b was the one that was in the wrong, and so he immediately burns the letter. After 40 days pass, the Prophet ﷺ tells these three that they must stay away from their wives, and Ka'b is told that he must stay away from his wife. And so he asks the Prophet ﷺ, am I supposed to divorce her? And he's told no, that the Prophet ﷺ has said just to stay away and do not touch her. You can't go approach your wife and have marital relations. And so this was told to all three of them, and then this lasts another 10 days where nobody speaks with them, even their wives, until on the morning of the 50th day that the Prophet ﷺ, he announces that Allah has accepted their repentance and that they are forgiven, where Allah says لَقَدْ تَابَ اللَّهُ عَلَى النَّبِيِّ وَالْمُهَاجِرِينَ وَالْأَنصَارِ الَّذِينَ اتَّبِعُوهُ فِي سَاعَةِ الْأُسْرَةِ من بعد ما كاد يزيغ قلوب فريق منهم ثم تاب عليهم إنه بهم رؤوف رحيم. That Allah has already forgiven the Prophet ﷺ and the Muhajirin and the Ansar who followed him in the hour of difficulty, after the hearts of a party of them had almost inclined to doubt, and then he forgave them. Indeed, he was to them kind and merciful. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals this in regards to these three, and they are forgiven, and all three are overjoyed, and now they come out, and the Sahaba meet them and greet them and welcome them like this. And so we see then in the following year that the 90th year after Hijrah, after the Battle of Tabuk, the Prophet ﷺ wanted to go on Hajj. But at this point in Mecca, those who worshipped idols were still coming to the Kaaba to do pilgrimage. And when they would come, there was rituals which were not appropriate for the Prophet ﷺ to witness, and he wasn't pleased with going there because he would witness these things. And that was such as people doing tawaf whilst they were naked. So the Prophet ﷺ didn't want to go until this was resolved. So he sends Abu Bakr radiallahu ta'ala anhu and Ali to Mecca to go and forbid any of these practices which are not in compliance with Islam, and that from this day on, that those who worship idols and idolaters will no longer be welcome to do the pilgrimage in Mecca at the Kaaba from this day on, and that only the Muslims. And so the Prophet ﷺ sends Abu Bakr and Ali, and they announce this, and that they have those people who wish to come and do the pilgrimage, they have 4 months to enter into Islam and to do the Hajj with 300 Muslims. And so the Banu Thaqif, we see a delegation comes and they become Muslim with the Prophet ﷺ. So the Prophet ﷺ sets up tents for them to remain in outside Medina and learn their religion. And when they come to the Prophet ﷺ, their youngest member, who was Uthman ibn Abi As, he was told to remain behind with the tribe to watch their campsite and the animals and the like which they had brought with them, whilst they would go and meet the Prophet ﷺ. And when they would return around midday and sleep, then he would quietly go to see the Prophet ﷺ, to go and ask questions and learn about Islam and learn the Quran. And so he would do this every day, Uthman ibn Abi As. And if the Prophet ﷺ was busy, he would then go to one of the other companions. And so he would go to Abu Bakr if the Prophet ﷺ was busy, or the like, until he became well versed in Islam and also in the Quran, radiallahu ta'ala anhu. And so when the Banu Thaqif finally decide to leave and go back, that the Prophet ﷺ names him, Uthman, as their leader and in charge of them in regards to their affairs. And so we now see delegations from all over Arabia come to the Prophet ﷺ to accept Islam. A Christian man, Adi ibn Hatim, he was highly regarded by his tribe, and so he comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and he wasn't the chief of the tribe, but he was highly regarded to the point they would give him 1/4 of the spoils of war, just him alone, because of his stature amongst the tribe. So he comes to the Prophet ﷺ, and he himself hated the Prophet ﷺ, and he wasn't inclined towards Islam. But so he decides to leave his home and come to the Prophet ﷺ to see for himself that is this just a normal king like all the other kings. So he comes to the Prophet ﷺ and he enters, and the Prophet ﷺ says to him, come with me to my home and walk with me. And so he begins to walk with the Prophet ﷺ, and on the way they see an old lady, and she stops the Prophet ﷺ, and she begins to tell the Prophet ﷺ her problems, and the Prophet ﷺ has stopped and he's listening to her problems and telling her what she should do and helping her to resolve her issues. And this Adi ibn Hatim, he says that this is no king. A king doesn't stop for somebody on the street. So he says this is no king. He says then at the Prophet's house, we entered the house, and the Prophet ﷺ, says he sits down on the floor and he has a cushion which he gives to me to sit on. So he himself sat on the floor, and then he gives me the cushion to sit on. And again he says that this is no king. A king would be sitting on a throne, or a king, if there's a cushion, he would be the one sitting on the cushion and not giving it to the guest. And he says, so this is no king. So the Prophet ﷺ then asks him, he says, do you know of any deity that exists other than Allah? And do you know of anything greater than Allah? And then the Prophet ﷺ says, do you not collect 1/4 of the spoils from your people, even though it's against your own religion, his faith? And this Adi bin Hatim admits that all of these three things, and he there embraces Islam and becomes Muslim. And like this we see many people around Arabia and many delegations, they begin to come to the Prophet ﷺ in person themselves. Those who'd had doubts, they would come to see him himself and to see if this was truly a prophet. Some came to test him. Others would send delegations on their behalf to go and accept Islam, or send people on their behalf to go and investigate who this man is. But we see now that huge number of people becoming Muslim, and this is we see that the call of Islam, the message of the Prophet ﷺ, has taken over Arabia and is now going beyond. So inshallah we will stop there, and tomorrow we will look at the farewell Hajj of the Prophet ﷺ, and inshallah we will look at the farewell Hajj of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam tomorrow, inshallah. Walhamdulillahi rabbil alameen. يا ربنا اعترفنا بأننا اقترفنا وأننا أسرفنا على لظى أشرفنا فتوب علينا توبة تغسل كل هوبة واستر الأرات وعامرات واغفر لوالدينا ربي ومولدينا وأهلي والإخوان وسائر الخلان وكل ذي محبة أو جيرة وصحبة والمسلمين وأجمع أمين. ربي يسمع فضلا وجود منا لا باكتساب منا بالمصطفى رسولي نهضى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي نهضى بكل سولي بالمصطفى رسولي نهضى بكل سولي وصلى وسلم ربي عليه أدى الهبي وآله وصحبه داد تاشي صحبه والحمد لله في البدء والتناهي. سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين. في كل لحظة أبدا عدد خلقه ورضا نفسه وزنة عرشه ومداد كلماته. اللهم صل وسلم وبارك عليه وعلى آله وصحبه. الفاتحة.